Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Emily Cash with the Freightways Media Team, and I'm happy to present this webinar in partnership with Fleetworthy. Today, we'll explore the challenges and opportunities fleets face in navigating cannabis regulations, compliance, and driver retention in an evolving legal landscape. I'm happy to be joined by Fleetworthy compliant experts Lori Johnson and Nick Helser.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm Lori Johnson. I've been with Fleetworthy for a little over 3 years now. I do have 27 years in transportation industry, mostly in food distribution, and a few years in construction before starting with Fleetworthy.
All right, and hi everybody. My name is Nick Helser. Thank you again for joining us today. As Lori said, we're really excited to be here and represent not only some really good information to take away, but also just providing some context on what can be a very multi-layered topic. At Fleetworthy, I've been here a little bit under 3 years. I am the driver services manager, so I run several teams and several processes that handle all of the services that Fleetworthy provides when it comes to the driver portion of operations. So that is anything to do with drug testing, with pre-hire services, document flow, what have you. So again, thank you for being here. Fleetworthy, if you are an industry aficionado and have been paying attention in the news, we have been quite busy over these last couple years in terms of combining forces with some very strategic and powerful companies to offer ultimately what we believe the ultimate suite of products for compliance and ancillary services when it comes to operating a motor fleet. We are the combination of a few different brands. The first one would be Legacy Fleetworthy Solutions, where Lori and I are coming from. The Best Pass company, the DriveWise company, and a couple other specific services that get along with our full suite of service offerings. So what does that exactly mean? The first one is CP Suite or Compliance Suite, which is our very unique and proprietary compliance platform that fleets can use to monitor their drivers, monitor their assets. They can make sure that compliance and safety is top priority with a very easy to use and comprehensive suite of services, even just within that one platform. So a big part of that is compliance records, making sure that your data is easily available and visible to you or anybody within your organization that needs to see it. On top of that, again, combining powers with Best Pass Toll, really aiming to simplify the toll management process and also to make sure that your dollars are being used as efficiently as possible. In terms of Form 2290s on the asset side, we do have Express Truck Tax as another one of our sub-brands, which is expediting and simplifying the process of filling out and submitting and managing those particular forms. And then of course, DriveWise, which really focuses on way station bypass. It reduces delays, it improves efficiency, and it makes sure that everything that needs to be communicated in terms of safety alerts to keep drivers' vehicles and the rest of traffic we share the road with in the best possible light and the best possible consistency when it comes to actually maintaining those services. As you can tell just by the brief description of each one, when they are separate, they are great, but when they are combined, they really offer a comprehensive and holistic way of managing fleet services. What that means for our customers, the biggest thing is reducing risk, meeting regulations, and making sure that safety is top priority. This happens with strong compliance solutions, as we mentioned above, having a multifaceted way of interacting with your fleet data and making sure that nothing is missed when it comes to making sure you are compliant with all of the regulations and keeping your drivers and assets up to date and compliant. We also streamline everything we can. So that is everything to do with fleet operations. We improve efficiency in every aspect of what we touch. And we also have a stellar group of subject matter experts behind the scenes, always assisting our customers and making sure that these processes are cohesive with the operations of the carriers that we work with. We optimize routes, we lower expenses, we improve driver safety, we have an optimal way of handling anything you can think of when it comes to the fleet management side of your company. But what we are talking about today, the challenge, is conflicting rules. And anyone who has interacted with or managed fleet operations know that there are several elements of doing so that do sometimes conflict. They sometimes have potential legal ramifications. They sometimes are just causing confusion when it comes to how to actually manage your operation. And one of the primary ones that we think was a very unique and topical subject for today's meeting was the state laws versus the federal regulations when it comes to specifically cannabis and cannabinoid products, and how that is such a great example of how things can sometimes conflict and cause that confusion. So what we'll really be focusing on is the specific regulations and opinions of that particular topic, but also focusing on the macro problem, as you can see in front of you, which is how do we deal with potentially conflicting laws and ever-changing regulations that might not be completely in sync with each other as time progresses. To put that into a visual, right now, 23 states allow adults to use marijuana recreationally. 39 states permit medical marijuana with a prescription. Now, not only does that separation and that differential potentially cause some of these complications in management, but it also is pointing out and reinforcing the fact that there are 50 states. What that means is 50 different ways of notating and potentially enforcing these laws. Now, what we're going to get into, and what I think the central theme that Lori and I will really be gravitating around, is that federal regulations always take precedence over state regulations when it comes to fleet management and the FMCSA. So we will get into a lot of those specifics when it comes to state law, but it is important to recognize that the federal regulations are the ones that need to be followed until there is a potential change that more closely reflects those policies with those in the states. On that note, you will notice that some states also have a much more closely related policy to the federal regulations, where some states might be a mile and a half away from actually having that cohesiveness. All right, with that, we do have a poll question. All right, so the question is, have you received a Department of Transportation positive test for marijuana in the past 12 months? The options are obviously different channels or types of tests that you could have received this positive result for. A would be pre-employment, B would be a DOT recordable accident, C is reasonable cause, D is a return to duty or follow-up test, and then E is simply no. You haven't had this issue within the last year. So please just take a couple moments to answer this. We can see the results with a overwhelming majority saying no, which is overall, I think. The obvious offender is pre-employment with a spattering of DOT recordable, reasonable cause, and return to duty or follow-up tests. We can obviously see that the trend that we see on the Fleetworthy operational level does certainly follow the trend we are seeing here. Pre-employment is, by our records, the greatest offender when it comes to receiving positive tests for specifically marijuana.
I'm really excited that half the people haven't had any positives.
Yes, that is terrific. And we can only hope that the global trend remains consistent with that. So yeah. Thank you all for participating. I hope that helps shed a little bit light of how we are seeing these results come back and how we are able to get a feel for where we're going in the future. So with that, I can go ahead and pass it off to Lori for the next few slides.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm jealous of all you people that never had any positive DOT tests. I mean, when I was a DER, I had many of them. So it's kind of exciting that you're not having to deal with some of these issues. At the end of the day, today, marijuana remains classified as a Schedule 1 substance under federal law. I know there's been a lot of discussion, and HHS last administration made some recommendations that it moved to a Schedule 3. It has not happened. So what we need to keep in mind is that marijuana still remains illegal on a federal level. It's still in the DOT panel under Part 40, where it lists the drugs. That's not changed. So today, the drivers are all under the same rules as they were, even if it's, it might be the drivers in Colorado where I live, and, it's definitely legal state level, but it is still a Schedule 1 substance under the regulations. Even if it does get moved, though, one thing that people aren't maybe aware of is there has been discussion in the last administration. They came out and said that even if it moves to Schedule 3, they may choose to leave it in the testing panel that DOT tests for. Some of that reason is, you're still in a safety sensitive position, and, there could be issues with allowing drivers to be on marijuana. So that whole conversation still has to be had, and a lot of things have to be worked out. And one thing to remember is the regulations exist to make sure that everyone is safe, right? The whole goal of DOT is to make sure that all the drivers and the motoring public, that they return home safely at night, that there aren't any issues. So we have to have that balanced discussion now that marijuana is becoming more accepted nationwide. Does that make it okay for someone in a safety sensitive position to partake? There's a lot of discussion on both sides. I try to think of it as if I'm on the road with a driver next to me, or on a plane and the pilot's taking me across the country, is that something I want to be aware of? Has this driver partaken of marijuana in a period of time where they could either be impaired or intoxicated? And to add to the disconnect and to the conversation, we don't have something like we have for alcohol to determine whether there is an impairment level. A lot of people want to equate marijuana with alcohol. Can't really do that because alcohol typically, depending on how much someone's had in their body type, it's typically out of their system within about 8 hours. With marijuana, that might not be the case. It could take 3 days or more, depending on use and body type, for them to lose the effects of that drug. And we have that discussion of impairment versus intoxication. Studies have shown that while a person might not feel intoxicated anymore, they may still have some cognitive impairment and maybe not making the best decisions in the heat of the moment. And going back to our driver on the road or our pilot in the air, if they're having to make a quick decision because something changed, we really want them to have good cognitive abilities and be able to make those decisions in the heat of the moment. So, it's a complicated discussion, as Nick alluded to at the beginning. There's so many facets of this, and we have to have a balanced discussion about what really makes sense. And as far as failed tests, a lot of you haven't had any, which is great. When I was a DER in motor carriers, we definitely had our fair share. And as marijuana use went up, we saw, as the laws changed, and they changed rapidly, we saw more usage, and then we did have a few more positives than we had in the past. So it's really important that you make sure your drivers are aware that DOT does have a zero tolerance policy right now. And it is, as we said, it's a Schedule 1 drug. They can't partake and be in a commercial motor vehicle. So they need to be aware of that. Even if their state allows it, that doesn't mean that they can partake. And then also, we haven't really talked about this yet, but CBD, similar situation, right? And that even adds to more confusion. I know some of the drivers where I had them call me and say, well, I tested positive, but I don't know how I can. I only use CBD for my aches and pains, right? Well, the problem with that is CBD is not a regulated industry. So it could be that there's more in there than the label says. If they're long-term users, it can build up in their system. And now they've got a positive test. And guess what? They have to go through the same process that anybody else has to go through. So it really makes for frustration and some issues, when you're trying to explain to your drivers, I'm sorry, but, we have to take you out of the truck and we have to go through this process. So here's our next poll question. Have you experienced operational challenges due to marijuana use? So probably half of our people haven't, since they haven't had the positive test. But for those of you that have you had to relieve a driver from a route? Or have you had to adjust routes or terminate a driver? I know I personally have experienced all of these. So curious to see what everybody else has experienced. So it looks like we have a lot of no tolerance folks here. 2/3 of you have terminated a driver due to a positive marijuana test. So, looking at some operational challenges, I definitely had my fair share of these when I was in your seat. We'd get a call that a driver, he took a random test 2 days ago, and now he's got a positive test. So now we have to scramble. You're trying to get the green beans and ketchup to the customer so that they have food for dinner tonight. And now you've got to deal with, what do I do? Your driver, if he's in town, it might be a minor inconvenience. If he's hundreds of miles away, it can be a real chore to try to get another driver there to relieve them, let them take the route and finish, get that other driver home. Creates lots of issues. We've also had to reroute, maybe if you don't have a driver that can take over that route when it goes next. You might have to, a lot of you are terminating, so we'll talk about no tolerance policies in a minute, but this can really create havoc. And now that you've got a late truck, you get the pleasure of calling your customers and saying, hey, I'm sorry, I know the driver's supposed to be there in a half hour, it's probably going to be later, we're doing the best we can. Just really creates a lot of issues and a lot of process changes when you have something like this. And your driver retention, that's part of the process. Personal experience, you have those positives and you get those issues that you have to deal with. So there's some states you can't terminate on first offense. So, Minnesota's one of them. We had locations in Minnesota and we had drivers that we were required to put them through a program. There's a handful of states that require that. Other states, they allow you to terminate, but you have to decide from your company's standpoint, are you comfortable terminating that driver and then going through the rehire process and trying to find another driver and taking the chance in 6 months you might have that driver test positive? Or do you want to try to retain that driver, let them go through the program and let them, stay on board and you're not retraining another driver and doing some of that? But I know when we go through all these retention and operational challenges, that's when Nick's team gets involved, right, Nick? So, you can help them with all of those testing criteria, right?
Absolutely. So we work very closely with wonderful partners to make sure that not only are the foundations of the drug and alcohol services in place, but they are accurate and they are following the regulations as appropriate. So that means setting up specific panels for whatever job classification requires those panels to be set up for. It's making sure that we work very closely with the administrators and managers directly from the motor carrier to manage those drivers and make sure that tests are scheduled on time, that they are accurate, that we provide the most efficient and expedited results of those tests that we can. And again, we have a wonderful support system of partners that we work very closely with to ensure that we are as timely and as serviceable to the needs of the motor carrier as we possibly can be.
Absolutely. And, those return to duty processes can be long and drawn out. I mean, I know I've had everywhere from 1 year to 5 years, and it's a hassle to try to keep track of all of that. So I know I appreciated, you guys being able to do that schedule and help keep track of all those follow-up tests, because it is a chore to, to make sure they're done on time. So where do motor carriers go from here, right? I mean, you've got a lot to think about. You've got the conflicting regulations. You've got the DOT versus the non-DOT drivers, right? DOT is only for CDL drivers, but do you want to test your non-CDL drivers? You can, but you have to check every state you're in and make sure that your policies are consistent. Make sure that you have good, robust policies and that you follow them, right? It's almost worse to have a policy and not follow it than not have a policy, because in litigation, that'll really come back to you and they'll say, well, you have this policy, why didn't you follow it? Making sure that your drivers, as we said, they're educated. I recommend that you walk the driver through the policy in orientation. I don't know any driver that wants to run home and read an 18-page DOT policy. And unfortunately, they end up being that long to cover all the things that you have to cover. So make sure that they're aware of it, and they can't say they didn't know that there's a risk with CBD, that marijuana is illegal, and making sure that you're doing that. And then exploring those testing methods. Today, the only option for DOT is urine. HHS hasn't approved those 2 labs yet, so we can't go to oral fluid, which can create some tension in states like California, where you can only test on the parent drug, you can't test on the metabolites. But hopefully soon they'll get those labs approved, and then people can do what they need to do. But there's the push for hair testing in some industries. Problem with that is you're going to see your positivity rate go up even more, because it does stay in the hair longer. And, I understand why some industries want to do that, but it also can cause a little bit more issues in hiring and then in retention. Urine, that's the middle of the road, as we all know. It'll stay in that metabolite for, anywhere of 2 weeks or so, sometimes more, depending on use. And it is the metabolite, so you do have the issue in California. But because DOT does overrule state right now, they can test for urine. Your only gray area is, can I take personnel action or not? And that's when you need to get legal counsel involved on that and determine your risk rewards on what action you're going to take. And then oral fluid, that's obviously an indicator of more recent use. It's only testing the parent drug, so that makes it a good choice. But I do know that it can increase your positivity rate in the short term, because it's a whole lot harder to cheat on an oral fluid test than it is in a urine test. I know I've experienced situations where drivers tried to cheat on a urine test, and thankfully most of them got caught. But with oral fluid, it's an observed test. So there's really no cheating on that one. So as you look at your policies, and once oral fluid becomes available, you may need to update your policy and make sure that you're referencing the types of tests for the situations you want, whether that's urine for pre-employment and oral fluid for post-accident. However you want to frame that program, make sure that you do it in a way that it's defensible and you can consistently follow it. And then last and definitely not least, make sure that you have good safety and compliance systems and partners. And Nick, I'll let you talk to that. You're involved in this all the time with clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can really speak to the efficiency and comprehensiveness that our CP Suite system has to offer. It has customizable data tiles. It has that are exportable, where all of the data that you want is at your fingertips and completely able to manipulate for your own numbers, but it also keeps a reliable data track for drivers in terms of documents, where we can customize expiration dates. So we always stay on top of ordering documents in a timely way so you're within regulation. Specifically to the drug testing component, every result is posted directly into the driver profile, which gives you next level visibility into not only the timeliness of seeing when the result is available, but also just being able to actually observe and take notes in a greater sense of operation when it comes to what those documents actually result in. And then in turn, for the motor carrier, the real benefit is you can make more confident decisions and you can make more confident policies that reflect not only the trend of where your drivers are, but the regulations that we adhere to.
Exactly. All right. And so our next poll question is, would you like our sales team to reach out and provide more information on any of our services? So we have the safety and compliance, the toll, the weigh station. If you want to explore more than one of these options, just click on one of them and the person that reaches out to you will help you navigate that and determine where it makes sense to start best with what your needs are. And then if you want the white paper, I know Emily said it would be available for download. And then also we have the QR code here if you want to scan and get it that way. And Emily, I think we're ready to see what kind of fun questions that the audience has for us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again to Lori and Nick for your insight on this discussion. I know it's very helpful for our audience. And yes, I'm not surprised, but we've got these questions coming in. So get ready. I'll try to kind of go in order, but I might skip around a little bit. We'll just see. We've got some interesting ones. I'll start off with this one. Is testing only for CDL drivers, or can I test my non-CDL drivers as well?
DOT testing is only for your CDL drivers when they're operating a CDL vehicle. So if you're going to hire a CDL driver, you need to do pre-employment DOT testing. If you choose to do testing for a non-DOT driver, so a non-CDL driver, you can do that if you have a non-DOT policy and you know that what your state allows you to do. So some states limit what you can and can't do in a non-DOT situation. So it's definitely something that you want to seek out legal counsel and make sure that all your regulations, you're not going against anything the state allows or disallows.
Does DOT always overrule state laws?
As far as testing, yes. Now, as I alluded to in California, there's some gray areas with what, because you're testing urine, you may or may not be able to take action. But if it's a DOT regulated CDL driver, then yes, the DOT testing would take precedent over the state.
Excellent. I'll hop on to this question. Does CBD carry the same penalty as THC?
Unfortunately, yes. So there is no valid medical reason to have that in your system. And since it's not regulated, it can build up in your system. And as we said, that label may not be reality. If it says 0.000%, it could be more. And if it builds up in your system and you get that positive, you have to go through the same return to duty process as any other drug.
Yikes. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next question. How do hair, urine, and oral fluid tests differ on results for THC use?
And we alluded to that a little bit earlier, but just to remind everybody, the hair keeps it the longest. So, there are some industries that want to do hair testing and they're pushing to make that accepted by DOT, which it is not currently. There's been some action to let it be allowed in DOT, but right now it's not. Urine, typically a couple weeks it'll stay in there, and then oral fluid is the least. It's the best indicator of recent usage, so it's typically 1 to 3 days depending on the person.
Got it. And then speaking of testing, let's kind of follow up with this question. What is the California metabolite issue you were referencing?
Okay, so California about a year ago, and I can't remember the number, it's like AB 2155 or something. It's a new law that they enacted saying that you could not take personnel action on a drug that tests for the metabolites of the drug, which is what urine testing does. And in the regulations, it says it's testing for the metabolites. And I don't know all the science lingo and all of that. I just know that urine test does the metabolites, where oral fluid only tests for the parent delta 9 parent drug. And so you can take personnel action if you're only doing a test on the parent drug, but unfortunately urine tests metabolites. And so that makes it that gray area I talked about with DOT testing. You're getting a positive result on metabolite, but the law says you can't take personnel action. So that's that gray area of federal conflicting with state, and how do you resolve that? So.
Got it. All right, let's move on to the next question. I think this is a good one too. If your company policy for CDL drivers explicitly states that you have a zero tolerance policy for positive marijuana tests, can you still terminate in the states where it is still legal?
Yes, if that's what your policy is and that's what you do, then you can do that. You just to make sure that you always do it and you don't play favorites. Now, again, as they said, subject to the state law, because there are at least a couple states that say you cannot term on first offense, Minnesota being one of them.
Excellent. All right, lots of questions coming in about drug testing, Lori. So I guess most of these are probably going to be geared towards you. But let's move on to this question. What happens when the driver is the victim of a laboratory error and is marked with a violation? Same-day negative DOT drug test, 3 tests haired negative by a police forensic specialist, and the FMCSA doesn't remove the violation.
First of all, hair testing is not allowed by DOT, so that test wouldn't be a valid DOT test. You would go with the urine test. So I'm not sure totally what that one's leading to.
Well, I think too, like, what happens if somebody is a victim of a laboratory error in general? Like, is there something else you can speak to that?
Yeah, there's an appeal process. I don't have every step memorized. I haven't done it for a while, but there definitely is an appeal process they could go through.
Got it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Any tips on finding SAP people to send drivers to?
Yes. We refer them to our EAP program, and they help them find a counselor. There's also just saplist.com you can go to find someone in your area. But usually we refer them to our EAP program, and then they would help them.
Yep, and if I could just add a little bit to that, the Fleetworthy services process is, Lori mentioned the SAP list website. That is traditionally what we offer, and then we have also recommendations from that list, depending on region or depending on preference of the clinic. You know, we can, that's part of this, the walkthrough service that we provide when a positive test is recorded and when a driver does have to select a program. We really try to help the motor carrier streamline that as much as possible.
Got it. Very helpful. Thank you, Nick. All right, let's move on to the next question. What about DOT 382.119, the stand down rule? What steps do I take in post-accident testing to ensure my driver is not continuing to drive while awaiting test results?
Well, I don't know that reg off the top of my head. I would tell you there is not a requirement that you keep your driver out of the truck while you're waiting the post-accident tests. Now, some people choose to do that, but I know in the companies I was in, they were large companies, and we couldn't have everybody waiting for a post-accident test be out of a truck, or even in the warehouse, right? The non-DOT tests, we didn't keep them off the floor until that test came back. Unless you have that reasonable cause thought that there was impairment was a factor in the accident, then we would keep them out of the truck. But there's not a requirement to keep them out of the truck waiting test results.
Interesting. Good to know. All right, we've got another question, Lori. Seems our audience has a lot of questions with the testing in California. So I know you kind of touched on that with the previous audience question, but I'm going to ask this one and maybe you can kind of help like reiterate. But this question is, with that issue with testing in California, does that only apply to companies and drivers who live in California, or does it apply to anyone tested in California?
I'm not 100% sure on the California law, but typically testing is based on the state of residence. So I would say probably California residents, but again, I don't know every single little piece of that law to know if it's somebody passing through. My guess is it's residents.
Got it. Yep. Yeah, me and Laura, we talked about this earlier. Maybe that might be like a seek legal counsel.
Yeah, exactly.
Type of situation. Yeah, Lori's here to advise as much as she can, but there are some things where, you know.
Yeah, I cannot provide legal advice.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next question. This is a good one. Seems much of the younger CDL driver generation is deciding to abstain from alcohol, as they tend to prefer cannabis among other alternatives to booze, alcohol, etc. Curious how the DOT and other regulators are addressing this aspect.
Well, currently, marijuana is still illegal, so they're not changing their minds on that, in large because of the safety sensitive nature of driving. So time will tell if a new administration has a different philosophy, but right now it's not been downgraded and it remains illegal. So
I think it's related to a kind of catch-all, to where if a substance alters the ability to potentially operate machinery of that magnitude, you know, it's better safe than sorry. At least that's kind of the feeling of the current regulations on a federal level.
Yeah, you've got that safety sensitive thing to deal with. So
absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next question. Are CDL drivers with a valid medical marijuana card still subject to these regulatory guidelines?
Absolutely. Medical card is not a prescription. It is not. In the current world, with the current regulations, there's no valid reason to have marijuana in your system. So medical card doesn't matter for a DOT test.
That's good to know. I think we've pretty much covered all of these questions that come through. Do have a couple more minutes, guys, if y'all have some more questions that you want to submit. But if no other questions come through, Nick, Lori, do y'all have any other comments that you want to say? Or Nick, I know we didn't really get too many questions for you, but anything you want to comment while we're waiting on maybe a few more questions to come through?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to reinforce, you know, what the Fleetworthy suite of services can provide, but also, you know, just to echo what Lori has been saying and what we've been kind of tandemly approaching here, is that it is critically important that whatever you as the motor carrier have as your internal policies, as the way of operating and managing your fleets, that kind of like one of the last slides mentioned, you really need to make sure that you are aware and that your drivers are being properly trained to be aware of these differences, of what the impact of some of these gray areas between state and federal regulations can mean, because it is just, especially for larger fleets, it is one misstep and that can have cascading effects depending on, you know, the severity or the consequences of the occurrence. So just make sure, everybody out there, make sure your policies are up to date. Make sure you are very aware of regulations where your drivers are domiciled or residenced, and with how that corresponds to the federal regulation. I would very much advise that you stay up to date with any FMCSA updates, because, no pun intended, this is kind of a fluid situation. You know, we all know how quickly and how drastically regulations can change sometimes, and it's very important to be on top of that, and of course to match make with a proper compliance platform and managed services to further ensure that you are indeed going beyond compliance. So that would be my closing comments, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. We do have a couple more questions that are coming through. I think we've got time to answer these. So I'm going to start with this one. Again, it's kind of touching around the testing questions and like more so like y'all's opinions on what we think the future will look like. But this question is, have any of you heard of any movement behind the scenes about changing the laws to allow THC use by CDL drivers when not driving?
Well, I think that touches on the intoxication versus impairment situation. I mean, if they're using on the weekend and then come to work on Monday, are they still impaired or not? So currently, the system says if you have enough in your system to pop positive on a test, it doesn't matter when you partook. If you're meeting that minimum level to have a positive test, then you're going to have to go through those hoops to get back in your truck.
Yeah. All right, let's follow up again with another question with the medical marijuana card. So does that mean that a driver with a medical marijuana card, like for cancer, cannot drive a truck since they would test positive?
In my opinion, it would be questionable. Definitely when they get their medical card from a DOT doctor, they need to mention that because it could disqualify them. And they also need to be aware that if they're, depending on how much they're taking and when they're taking it, if they have enough in their system that a test would pop positive, then yeah, it would disqualify them. So I think it's something they need to discuss with their medical doctor, their DOT doctor, and get everyone on the same page. Because again, you've still got that intoxication impairment situation if they're habitual users of it. And I understand the medical part of it, but it could be disqualifying.
Yeah, good to know. All right, I think we've got our last question, and this is kind of like a two-part, so it's a little bit long, so bear with me. And if I need to repeat anything, y'all just let me know. If my crew drive a CMV up to 26K GVW non-CDL, one, the FMCSA is into effect, even though it is legal up to 5 nanograms in Washington State. And then part two of that, however, with the USA DOT number on the truck, we must follow FMCSA at zero compliance regardless.
So the DOT regulations are only for trucks over 26,000 pounds and a CDL driver. So you're not going to be subject to the DOT drug and alcohol testing at those situations. You would be subject to your company policy and your state laws. And I don't know every state law. So sounds like they're in Washington, and I know they're like California, they have some one-off rules that I'm not necessarily aware with. But the main thing is you're under 26,000 pounds, you're not a CDL driver, you're not a CDL vehicle. So it's not going to apply.
Excellent.
Yep. And Lori, that's actually a great point. And I just thought of that as potentially another thing to close out here. We would be remiss to say that, you know, the state, some of this in context might sound like the state regulations are just worthless, don't worry about it, but that is not the case if they are a non-CDL and not applicable to the DOT regulations. That is something to where Lori just mentioned, it is about company policy and it's about the state regulations. We alluded to earlier in the slideshow that 50 states means 50 different ways of notating or interpreting these different laws. And it's very important that everybody stay brushed up on the states that are relevant to your operation, especially for drivers that might just drive a pickup or might just drive a company car or anything below that 26,000 pounds. So something very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. And I know I live in Colorado. They define a commercial motor vehicle at 16,000 pounds. Now, you don't need a CDL till 26, but even California at 10,000, some regulations kick in. So it's really important to understand your states. And some of them have their own drug and alcohol regulations. So you really have to know those state laws. So thank you for bringing that up.
No, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot to navigate. And I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Maybe we should do like a part 2, it seems like, because again, it can be challenging, a lot of gray area, not so black and white. So again, we really appreciate Nick and Lori, y'all coming on here and giving your expertise. As we mentioned, we do have the white paper available via that QR code. And then it's also on your webinar console if y'all want to download that and just kind of get a little bit more information on the findings regarding this topic. And then there's also a few other resources that we included in the webinar console that are just different white papers that you can access that might be helpful for you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here. So again, just a big thank you to Nick and Lori for sharing your insights with us today. I know this was a very, very helpful session for our audience members in navigating this tricky landscape. So thank you again for your insights. And as a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be sent to our viewers here via the email you used to register with. So if you need a copy, that's where you can find it. And we hope you will join us again for our next FreightWaves webinar. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude. And thank you everyone for your time.